Today I'm going to go over what I think is the 5 types of reboot. In my opinion, there are 5 different types, and each type has a specific point of relevance and point of comparison with the original. However, I could be completely wrong, in my opinion, and each type could either be a soft or hard reboot, but the differences between them is a subject for yet another video. What are the 5 types of reboot? First type of reboot is a much needed refresh of an existing franchise. It breathes new life into a franchise, either reminds the existing fan base that there is a reason why they fell in love, while also telling potential fans that this franchise does exist. Basically just a total revamp of an existing franchise that works to restore all faith in the original and brings the company that made it a lot more relevance. At the same time, keeps it alive or revitalizes it after a period not on the air. The second type of reboot is not necessarily really needed, but it expands on existing franchise's viewer base, say updating its visuals, changing the look of the characters, updating the storytelling, and perhaps it improves upon action sequences and dramatic storytelling in a way that is more appealing to a modern audience, while also taking full advantage of more modern distribution methods to reach a greater audience, thus perhaps can give the original franchise a greater viewer base, but it does it in such a way that doesn't alienate the existing fan base, or it creates an entirely new fan base larger than the original. The third type of reboot doesn't really do much of anything special. It might say, for example, update the visuals and correct film limitations at the time of production, but the franchise itself is still ongoing, or perhaps has enough on a viewer base that a reboot seems unnecessary. However, it doesn't do anything really drastic. Nothing is really changed, but it might allow existing fans to remind themselves of the original story, while also allowing new fans to get involved without having to play catch-up, which can be a very difficult thing to do. The fourth type of reboot is something of an anomaly. It's stuck between its own identity and the property in which it's based. In other words, it can't find something special that the original had, but at the same time it can't really find its own identity, because it either tries too hard to be its own show, or it tries to be too much like the original without trying to develop its own sense of identity. Most reboots typically try and balance their own identity with the identity of the original, and a lot of them do it quite well. However, the fourth type of reboot tries to move in more than one direction at once, and it doesn't really do much of anything. It just sort of sits there. It doesn't necessarily really establish a new audience, but it can't really rely on the original fan base because it doesn't have enough of the original to start feelings of nostalgia, or it might alienate some of the original fan base rather than get them to remember fond memories of their childhood or teenage years. The fifth type of reboot is basically something that just, at least in my opinion, makes you ask why. What would have given the director pause to revive this particular show? Why did they think bringing back such a franchise was a good idea? Or why was it done in such a poor manner? Sometimes it can be a whole host of different questions that make you ask why, and it doesn't always necessarily really work. Well, I suppose that I've given you the lowdown on the 5 different types. Maybe a few examples might also explain it. And I will also refer to these reboots as type 1 through 5 for my own sanity. An example of a type 1 reboot is the J.J. Abrams Star Trek films. Say what you will about them, but the first one of these films came around just around about the right time. Star Trek had rested for a while, but the trailers and film pitch got the original fans talking about the franchise again and comparing it to the original. At the same time, it got more people involved in the discussion, but also it showed what Star Trek could do on a huge scale with more modern effects. But it also reminded people that Star Trek did exist, bearing in mind at the time when Star Trek sort of was laid to rest, so to speak. The franchise had gone through franchise fatigue. The latest TV show had flopped, and the film box office returns had been gradually declining over several years. There are many different examples of what I call a Type 2 reboot. The two that comes to mind almost immediately is Space Battleship Yamato 2199 and the Legend of the Galactic Heroes, The New Thesis. Namely, Space Battleship Yamato is reasonably well known in the anime community, but there aren't that many who could say the fact they've watched it, given the overall poor presentation and the fact the animation hasn't necessarily really aged well. As a result, they decided to give it a modern retelling of the story with a fresh new look, with a few changes here and there to the story to make it more of what it is, while also making it more appealing to the eye of the anime audience in 2012. But also by deliberately using DVD and Blu-ray distribution, and later on anime streaming platforms, they allowed more people to enjoy the franchise in their own time, rather than having to spend hours trying to find poorly done clips of it online. Legend of the Galactic Heroes, on the other hand, is also reasonably well known in the anime community, but once again, I think many could never really say the fact they've watched it. There's also the fact that the lack of an English dub can make it more difficult for non-Japanese speakers to follow the story, and given the fact the original was only really available in Japan, it also makes it difficult. When they decided to reboot the show in 2018, it was decided to completely correct the stiff animation and also try and make the space battle sequences more dramatic and entertaining for the original viewer, while also cutting out some necessary fluff. They also decided when they did it to take full advantage of the growing anime community and anime streaming platforms to further increase viewership, thus making it actually probably more successful than the original. An example of the third type of reboot is a very recent one, and that is RWBY Ice Queendom. What exactly does this show do? Well, it retells the story of the original RWBY, but it cuts out a lot of the unnecessary stuff, so it allows newer viewers to get into RWBY and to understand what's going on, and two, it corrects for poor quality animation when the show initially came out, because it was a fact at the time that when RWBY first came onto the pop culture scene, that Rooster Teeth was only very small in terms of its animations as a studio, and it had a limited budget for animation equipment. As a result, they could only really use what they had available at the time. Now, the best example of a Type 4 reboot, in my opinion, has got to be She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, which is a reboot of the 1980s cartoon She-Ra, the Princess of Power. As a show, it's not a bad effort on its own, but it does nothing special. It's only sort of meanders here and there, which doesn't necessarily really help it in terms of its overall watch factor. At the same time, it relies too much on the original source material, which is true of Type 4 reboots, but at the same time, it tries to do its own thing. But it can't really do its own thing because it's trying to do the original. And at the same time, She-Ra was an 80s toy brand that just sort of came, went, and died. It's remembered by fans of the show in the 1980s, but that's about it. That's all anyone could ever really say about it. Now, as for the so-called dreaded Type 5, well, there are several examples that do come to mind, but I haven't watched them, so I can't really form an opinion on something that I haven't watched. But there is one example of this type of reboot, and that is rather the reboot of Gossip Girl. The original show was an angsty teen drama that at least did something right, namely the fact it had enough an audience to last for 5 seasons. However, the new show was not requested nor required, and given the fact that most people have mixed feelings about their teenage years, gone as I do, it doesn't actually really work. So why on earth would you want to revive a show to a modern standard that sort of really just came and went, and at the same time do it without none of the style and charm of the original, with poor scripts and, I wouldn't say bad performances by the actors, but definitely a lot of odd choices when it comes to the actors. It just doesn't really work as a show, and because I don't think at least it wasn't needed or required. Fan consensus seems the fact they wanted the show to do good, but given the way it was handled, it didn't really work all that well, which is probably another problem with streaming. Because you have a captive audience, you don't necessarily really need to compete. If anything, the Gossip Girl reboot has probably killed Gossip Girl entirely, and maybe looked back upon as just a failed pop culture thing, although in this landscape that could basically mean the fact it just has people online complaining about how bad the show was treated. Well, thanks for watching. I'm the Universal Challenger. I ask you to please leave a like, comment, subscribe, and share the video with your friends, and I'll catch you in the next one.